In this fourth presentation, we're looking at how the West dominated the Middle East in ancient times. Previously, we looked at how Alexander and the Greeks conquered the Persian Empire. In the course of just a few years, the Greeks took over all of the territory that the Persian kings had controlled. The Greeks, however, did not keep control of that territory. Alexander's generals broke up the empire into several kingdoms. Some kingdoms, like the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, lasted for a couple hundred years, but the Greeks lost control over most of their territory. The next great power that rose in the ancient world was the Roman Empire. Now, when you take a class in school on Western civilization, much of the time is usually spent on the Roman Empire. That's because the Romans, along with the Greeks, made Europe. But the focus of this study is not on Europe, but on the Middle East. So we'll take just a moment on the Romans just to see how the Romans changed the Middle East. The people of Rome started as humble shepherds, settled on the 7 hills near the Tiber River. They had developed a form of democracy. The respected men of the city met together in an assembly that was known as the Senate. Now, after a long period of struggle, the people of Rome overthrew the domination of a foreign king, and the idea of kings was distasteful to the Roman people. They developed a government where men were placed in charge for a 1-year term, and they had to answer to the Senate. It was a variation of the democracy that the Greeks had developed, and it set the basis for a strong Roman government for several hundred years. And it's true, most of the people in Rome didn't have a voice in the government, but this government was more open than the despotism or the dictatorship of a king. Over the years, the Romans fought against, and eventually conquered, other peoples who lived on the Italian peninsula. They fought Carthage in a series of memorable wars, which are known as the Punic Wars. By the end of these wars, the Romans had gained control of North Africa and Spain. When the Romans began to fight against Greece, the added responsibility of governing conquered territories put a terrible strain on the republican form of government. The strength of the army produced men who challenged the Senate for control of the government. They sought to turn the democracy of the Senate into a military government. Now, the Romans efficiently governed their territories. They expanded into Gaul, which is present-day France, and into Britain, and into the site of present-day Turkey, which the Romans called Asia. In the 1st century BCE, the Romans ended the Seleucid kingdom that took over Judea, and finally conquered the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. That's when Mark Antony and Cleopatra fought against Octavian. Mark Antony died, Cleopatra committed suicide, and Octavian became Emperor Augustus. By this time, the Republic had pretty much come to an end. It continued in name only with a weakened Senate. It was the emperor now who controlled the government. The Roman Empire by this time had become a despotism, a dictatorship. Now, about 100 years after Augustus, Emperor Trajan conquered the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. This was known by the Greek name of Mesopotamia. Roman control in this province didn't last long, however. After about 100 years or so, the Parthians drove the Romans out of Mesopotamia. The Romans controlled only a fraction of the Middle East that the Greeks and Persians had controlled. So their military didn't have a lasting effect on this region. It was the Roman religion that had a long-lasting effect on the Middle East. At the start of the 1st century, a Jewish preacher named Jesus preached in the region of Galilee and performed miraculous signs. Jesus' followers believed, as do most Christians in the present day, like myself, that after Jesus was crucified, he rose from the dead and returned to heaven from where he had come. The early Christians gathered together on a regular basis. They went to other cities to start new churches, and they spread the message of Jesus throughout the world. After a couple hundred years, the Christian church had grown so large and powerful that the Roman emperors began to feel threatened. They tried to persecute Christians, putting them in prison and even killing them, but that didn't work to stop the religion. Finally, in 311 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, and the Christian church became a strong institution in the Roman world. And eventually, the Roman emperors would outlaw every other religion besides Christianity. Now, the leader of all Christians within a city was known as the bishop. The bishops of the large cities exerted more influence than the bishops in the smaller towns. Now, Constantine had made a huge change when he legalized Christianity. The other major change that Constantine made came when he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a new city. Constantine wanted to call this city Nova Roma, or New Rome, but after his death it became known as Constantinople. So the Bishop of Rome exerted great influence. Even though Rome was no longer the capital, it had been the number one city in the empire for hundreds of years. The Bishop of Rome also exerted great influence. Today, the Bishop of Rome is known as the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, is also known as the Pope. Now, the city of Constantinople also grew in influence as the capital of the empire, and the bishop in that city also exerted influence. Eventually, the Eastern Orthodox Church broke from the Roman Catholic Church, and the Bishop of Constantinople, or the Patriarch, became the head of Eastern Orthodoxy. So the bishops in these two towns were a couple of the most influential within the empire. The other large cities were Antioch and Alexandria, and the bishops of these cities also exerted some amount of influence. In the 300s and 400s, the church was racked by huge theological wars, mostly concerning the nature of Jesus. The question was how much of Jesus was human and how much was divine. Some said that Jesus' divine nature completely overwhelmed his human nature, while others maintained that Jesus' human nature was just as active as his divine nature. I don't have time to go into the details here, and I don't really understand all of the theology. But it was a huge issue at the time, and the bishops of Antioch and Alexandria led the different sides of the disagreement. Eventually, people forgot about the controversies, but Christianity flourished in the Middle East for several hundred years. Not even the forces of Islam could drive it completely from the region. Christians were buried by a Muslim tidal wave, but they kept their traditions alive down to the present day. There is the Assyrian Church of the East, with members in Syria and Iraq, even in India. The number of these Christians are in the tens of thousands, perhaps even in the hundreds of thousands. I don't have a whole lot of information on this group. Christians in Lebanon came to be known as Maronites, and the history of the modern nation of Lebanon is the story of the search for balance between Muslims, Christians, and other groups. And in Egypt, the Coptic Church has survived. Coptic Christians, I believe, are a rather widespread group in Egypt. It includes such people as Boutros Ghali, who was the former Secretary General of the UN. Another prominent Coptic was the former Miss Universe Egypt. That's part of the great information that you get from Wikipedia. Now, in the old city of Jerusalem, the different sects of the Eastern Orthodox and the Egyptian and Syriac churches are well represented in the Christian quarter, and many of the Palestinians are actually Christians. Their voice, however, is usually drowned out by the Palestinian Muslims. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to show how much Christians have influenced the Middle East. When people think of the Middle East, they think of Islam, and that's a valid viewpoint. Islam is the most dominant force in the Middle East. That's not the only force. I've made this presentation and the ones preceding it to show the non-Islamic contributions to the culture of the Middle East. In the 600s, Arabs came out of the desert, followers of Muhammad. They took over the Middle East and have not relinquished control to this day. But they came to a place that many different peoples contributed. Ancient Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Jews, Greeks, Roman Christians, and peoples from outside the region like the Parthians, Armenians, even the Indians and Chinese. These people were all living here when the Arab Muslims came, and they made some changes to Muhammad's message, as we'll see next time.